about to begin number 172. Tonight, we make a departure from the regular order of the Thursday night talks, and the subject will be the background of the great change that took place in the Am Yisrael. In order to understand what happened to the Jewish people, it's important to look back to the roots. Now, we're not going all the way back because we don't have time for such a wide scope tonight. But we should understand that 150 years ago, 200 years ago, the Am Yisrael was
1:50
not
p.m.
included in the list of nations. It was Ein Om Levodod Yishkan. It was a nation that dwelt alone. Now, there were times when our people were better. There were ups and downs in our history, but all throughout the history of the Jewish people, the nation in its entirety, with small exceptions, was Am HaTorah. It's important to know. And it was unlike any nation. All the nations of the world were sometimes better, sometimes worse, but by and large, all the nations were Mishpechos Ha'adamo. They were nations of the earth. They were nations of Gashmias. And even their so-called religions were confined to a small portion of the people. The people did not study their religion. That was definitely out of the question. The people had belief in their saints and in their idols, but with always the people thronged to their temples just as they did in Greece and in Egypt and in Babel and in China and India. So they did it in Europe too. But the nations of the world were Mishpechos Ha'adamo. They lived with Gashmias. They were materialistic nations. They lived, of course, it doesn't mean that they were like they are today, because today there's a breakdown in government. In those days there was a government, whether it was a king or some other form of government, criminals were not prosecuted. They didn't coddle criminals. However, the nations in general were not moral, and in general they didn't have any system of laws by which the people themselves lived. They had laws that were imposed on them. There was a Roman code, a civil code. The people were forced to abide by the laws that the king enforced. But nobody had an ideal of gathering to study the laws and to foster the knowledge of their laws among themselves. Only one nation that did that was the Ein Am Levodod Yishkan. There's only one nation in the world. The Jewish people studied its Torah, and everybody tried to keep it, from big and little, learned and ignorant. The Jewish nation was a kosher nation. You could eat in the home of every Jew. Like they used to say, if his name is Mendel, you can eat from his spindle. There was no problem among the Jewish people of kashrus. A Jew could come from one part of the world to another part of the world, and he could trust them that they went to the shochet, and they had a mikveh, and they taught their children Judaism. That was the system all over the world among Jews. And today, we see that it's not the system of the Jewish people. We see today that only a minority keeps Shabbos. And even kashrus today, only a minority observe it. rotate. And the vast majority of Jews are almost atheists because they have no contact with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and no contact with His Torah and almost no contact with the mitzvahs. Even Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, there are so many Jews who never walk in today. And therefore, it pays for us to know what happened. And we're going back a little bit in our past and see some superficial things, but most people don't even know these superficial things. They have an idea that everybody in Europe was kosher and was observant up to that time Hitler came, and Hitler stepped into communities that were just as good as they always were, and he destroyed them. Now the beginning. Most of our words here will devolve upon Old Russia, because Old Russia was the place where 6 million Jews lived. That was at least half of the Jews of the world, maybe more than half of those days. So the history of the Jewish people was mostly a history of Russian Jewry. What happened subsequently to the nations around Russia, such as Austrian, Hungarian Kingdom, and Romania, and other places adjacent to Russia, they're all the results of what happened in Russia. The Crimean War, which ended in 1863, Russia was engaged in a war with Turkey, and there were other nations involved. And Russia had a defeat. This war brought great changes in the Russian way of life. Because up till now, Russia was petrified. It was like stone. There were no changes in Russia for 1,000 years. Now we have to know that that's very important for us, because to know that the Jewish people lived in Russia in an unchanging agrarian peasant existence. They were peasants. The whole nation of Russia lived off of farming. Very little commerce. Everything in Russia was frozen into inactivity. One of the reasons was that the rulers of Russia were extremely conservative. They were very much afraid of any innovations, because they were autocrats, they were absolute monarchs. Now all around them, everywhere in Europe, monarchies were toppling. So the Russian ruling house tried to build up an insulating wall to separate it from the rest of the world, so that there shouldn't be any thought of revolution in Russia. What happened in France, what happened in other countries, terrorized them. They were frightened that some of the germs of the French revolutionary spirit might enter Russia. And therefore, they discouraged contact with other countries. And there were no changes. There was not even a railroad in Russia. Of course, railroads weren't anywhere else either, but when railroads began, they began all over the world, but not in Russia. It took a long time. There weren't even real roads in Russia. Big roads for horse-drawn vehicles didn't exist, because everything was petrified. Now, because of that, it was easy to some extent for the Jewish communities to continue their ancestral ways. And everything was done as it had been done 200 years or 400 years ago. The peasants used the same tools, and the artisans the same processes, and Russia was petrified. But in 1863, when Russia lost the Crimean War, it was a great shock to the Russian Empire. And certain changes began to enter. And the conditions of our people, the Jewish people, now became strongly affected. During the war, France and England and Turkey had blockaded the Baltic seaports Now Russia had no railroads as yet. Therefore, all merchandise which needed to be transported to and from the interior of Russia, and also which had to be transported to Prussia. Prussia, as before Germany was completely unified. So Prussia was right next to Russia, and they were neutral. Prussia was neutral in this war. So now they had to send all of these during the war because the seaports were blockaded. They had to send all of their merchandise by wagon on the St. Petersburg-Warsaw Road through Covenant. Or they sent it by ship on the rivers and the lakes of rivers. Now, this great inland movement proved a material blessing to the districts of the Jewish settlement. I'll explain that. Jews were not permitted to live anywhere in Russia, except in certain places. It was called the Pale of the settlement. The Pale meant the fence. Jews were restricted to certain districts. In the interior of Russia, Jews couldn't live. So they were crowded in certain sections where there were Jewish towns, old Jewish towns. Americans don't understand that picture. Jews didn't live in Gentile towns. There were no Gentile towns in Russia, except in the interior. But in the Jewish districts, all the towns were Jewish towns. As you entered the town, you saw the Erev. The Erev means the beginning of the town. Erev over the road. Could be carried in it. As soon as the Erev began, the paving began. It was rough paving. Cobblestone paving. But the Erev and the cobblestones began. That was civilization. The Jewish town. Outside was Gentile huts with hay roofs. I still saw it when I was in Europe. I came to Europe over 45 years ago. I still saw that. Jewish towns. Every Jewish town had one huge church. And the steeple rose way above the entire community. But otherwise, the entire town was a Jewish town. All the stores were Jewish stores. There weren't any Gentile stores. The Gentiles were peasants. Now, when they started this great inland movement during the war, because the ports were blockaded, so that began to bring a lot of business to the Jews in the Jewish districts, because they had to travel along the roads that led through the Jewish Pale of the settlement. The resultant prosperity raised up a new class of well-to-do people in the Jewish towns and villages. Up to now, the standard had been poverty. Everybody was more or less on the poverty level. Even the rich were very far from our concept of well-to-do people. But now things began to change. In 1855, the telegraph came to Russia. In 1858, they began their first railroad. They have to understand the situation of the government. The government didn't have anybody with whom to contract to do the railroad. Only Jewish contractors. Jews made contracts with the government to build a railroad. They brought in Jews from France, a big engineering company, and that's how Russia began to wake up from its age-old sleep. But at that time,